This is Ashish, and you are watching the Tantric Archive, the universities that taught Tantra, the hidden education of the ancient world. Imagine walking into a university. Students debating philosophy, monks studying consciousness, scholars writing ancient manuscripts. Sounds normal, right? But what if I told you that over 200 years ago, some of the world's greatest universities secretly taught Tantra? Yes, real universities, with libraries, professors, entrance exams, and hidden tantric teachings. And here's the shocking part. Some of these universities were larger and more advanced than Oxford or Harvard, centuries before they even existed. But wait, that's not even the most surprising part, because in one of these universities, students were taught rituals meant to awaken hidden powers of consciousness. And in another, there were entire departments dedicated to tantric philosophy and meditation. So the real question is this: why did universities teach Tantra? And why did this knowledge suddenly disappear? Today, we uncover the lost universities of Tantra. And trust me, by the end of this video, you will never look at ancient education the same way again. Before we begin, remember these 3 questions, because we will answer them later. First, why did the largest university in the ancient world secretly teach tantric practices? Second, why did Tibetan monks travel thousands of miles to study Tantra in India? And third, what happened to these universities? And why were they destroyed almost overnight? Most people think Tantra was always a secret mystical tradition. But history shows something very different. At one point, Tantra was actually part of formal university education. Yes, a structured academic discipline with teachers, debates, texts, and students from across Asia. And when I first learned this, honestly, I couldn't believe it, because modern history books almost never talk about this. But once you see the evidence, it becomes impossible to ignore. So let's start with the first place, the largest university of the ancient world. Around the 5th century CE, in the plains of Bihar, India, a massive university rose called Nalanda. And when I say massive, I mean massive. Nalanda had 10,000 students, 2,000 professors, and a library so huge, it reportedly burned for 3 months when it was destroyed. Now here is where things get interesting. Nalanda wasn't just a Buddhist university, it was more like an ancient global knowledge hub. Students studied logic, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, grammar. But hidden inside this intellectual ecosystem was something far more mysterious. Tantric Buddhism. Yes, advanced tantric teachings were studied there, but not openly. Only the most advanced students were allowed access. Why? Because tantric practices were considered dangerous without proper training. Think about it. This was like the graduate level of spiritual education. But Nalanda was just the beginning, because about 400 years later, another university appeared, and this one was even more connected to Tantra. Around the 8th century CE, King Dharmapala founded Vikramashila University, and this place had a very specific purpose: training Tantric Buddhist masters. Yes, unlike Nalanda, where Tantra was only one subject. At Vikramashila, it became a central focus. Some historians even say Vikramashila had 6 major faculties, and one of them was dedicated to esoteric practices, which included tantric meditation systems. But wait, that's not even the most fascinating part, because the scholars trained here went on to change the spiritual history of an entire region, Tibet, and we'll talk about that soon. But first, there's another forgotten university, one that most people have never heard of, Odantapuri University. Built around the 8th century, and according to Tibetan sources, This place was another major center of Tantric learning. Students came from India, Tibet, China, Nepal, just to study here. So think about this for a moment. More than 1,000 years ago, there were international universities teaching Tantra, not secret caves, not hidden cults, universities, which raises a huge question. What exactly were they teaching? Most people today hear the word Tantra and immediately think of something sexual, but historically, that idea is completely wrong. In these universities, Tantra was primarily about consciousness and transformation. Students studied things like advanced meditation, mantra, science, visualization techniques, energy systems of the body. In Tibetan Buddhism, these became known as Vajrayana practices. But here's something fascinating most people don't know. Some of these teachings were considered so powerful that students had to take vows before learning them. Yes, actual spiritual contracts, because teachers believed misuse could harm the practitioner. Now imagine being a student there. You study philosophy for years. You master logic. You debate Buddhist metaphysics. And only then, your teacher might say, you are ready for the next level. And that level was Tantra. Imagine walking through those university corridors, monks debating reality, scholars translating Sanskrit texts, students practicing meditation for hours, and somewhere inside, a small group learning advanced tantric practices. But here's something even more surprising. Tantra wasn't only taught in Buddhist universities. Another powerful tradition was developing at the same time, Kashmir Shaivism. And this was equally intellectual. In the region of Kashmir, between the 8th and 12th centuries, a brilliant philosophical movement emerged, Kashmir Shaivism. And unlike what many people imagine, these teachings were incredibly intellectual. Scholars wrote extremely complex philosophical texts, debated metaphysics, analyzed consciousness, and developed sophisticated tantric theories. Some historians even compare their debates to ancient Greek philosophy, but with a twist, because instead of just discussing reality, they developed practices to experience it directly. And one of the greatest scholars here was Abhinavagupta. Now, this man was extraordinary. He was a philosopher, a tantric master, a poet, a theologian, and he wrote one of the most important tantric texts ever created, Tantraloka, which literally means the light of Tantra. This book was basically an encyclopedia of tantric philosophy and practice. And here's something incredible. Many scholars believe Abhinavagupta was trained in multiple tantric traditions at once: Buddhist, Shaiva, Shakta. Imagine that level of interdisciplinary study. This wasn't superstition. This was advanced spiritual scholarship. But the story becomes even more interesting when we look at who studied in these universities. One of the most famous students connected to these universities was Atiśa Dipankara. He studied at Vikramashila University and became one of the greatest Buddhist teachers in history. Later, he traveled to Tibet and helped revive Buddhism there. But here's the fascinating part. Atiśa didn't just bring philosophy, he brought tantric teachings, which later became a core part of Tibetan Buddhism. So if you see Tibetan monks practicing Vajrayana today, much of that knowledge traces back to Indian tantric universities. Another fascinating story involves Naropa. Naropa was originally a brilliant scholar at Nalanda, a master of philosophy. But one day, he realized something shocking. Intellectual knowledge alone wasn't enough. So he left the university and searched for a tantric master named Tilopa. What happened next became legendary. Naropa went through 12 extremely difficult spiritual trials, and eventually became one of the greatest tantric masters ever known. When I first heard this story, it completely changed how I saw ancient education, because it shows something powerful. Universities taught theory, but Tantra demanded direct experience. And that tension between knowledge and experience still exists today. Now we need to address something important, because Tantra is probably one of the most misunderstood traditions in the world. Today, many people associate Tantra only with sexuality, but historically, that was a tiny part of a much larger system. Most tantric practices were actually about meditation, mantra, visualization, energy, transformation. Yet, modern media often focuses only on the sensational parts, and honestly, that creates a distorted picture. Here is a controversial opinion. Some scholars believe Tantra was actually the most sophisticated spiritual psychology of the ancient world. Yes, even more advanced than many systems today. Now, of course, not everyone agrees. Some historians argued Tantra was always controversial, even in ancient times, and they're not entirely wrong, because many orthodox scholars did criticize tantric practices. Some believed they were too radical, too experimental, too dangerous. Which leads to another mystery. If these universities were so advanced, why did they suddenly disappear? Around the 12th century, something tragic happened. Several of these great universities were destroyed. Nalanda, Vikramashila, Odantapuri, all vanished within a few decades. Historical accounts describe massive library burnings, monks fleeing, manuscripts lost forever. Imagine centuries of knowledge gone. Some historians believe thousands of texts disappeared, including many tantric manuscripts. But here's the haunting question. What knowledge was lost? Because even today, we only have fragments of those teachings. Many texts survived only because Tibetan monks had copied them earlier. Without Tibet, much of tantric philosophy might have vanished completely, which is honestly mind-blowing. Now here's the surprising part. These traditions didn't completely disappear. They evolved. Today, many meditation systems in Tibetan Buddhism trace their roots directly to Nalanda and Vikramashila. Scholars still study Abhinavagupta's Tantra, and modern researchers are discovering something fascinating. Many tantric meditation techniques resemble modern neuroscience insights about the mind, which raises a provocative question. Were ancient tantric scholars exploring consciousness in ways we are only beginning to understand today? Most people don't know this, but several modern universities now study tantric philosophy academically. So, in a strange way, the university tradition of Tantra has returned, just in a different form. So let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Over 1,000 years ago, universities in India taught Tantra as an advanced discipline. Scholars debated it. Students traveled across continents to learn it. Masters wrote enormous philosophical works about it. And then suddenly, much of that world disappeared. Yet the ideas survived, hidden in texts, preserved in Tibetan monasteries, waiting to be rediscovered. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of all, because history shows something surprising. Tantra was never just a secret mystical practice. It was once part of the greatest educational institutions of the ancient world. And if this knowledge was once taught in universities, what other ancient wisdom might we have forgotten?